Okay, it's Brian, and this week we're talking about Chapter 25. And Chapter 25 in the textbook has two topics in it. And the first is electromagnetic induction. And the idea is this, that changing magnetic fields can induce electric potential differences. We'll talk about things related to that. But there's another topic, and that's electromagnetic waves. And it turns out that's related to the phenomenon of induction. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about electromagnetic waves, which are waves of electric and magnetic fields, as the name kind of implies. They come in a wide range of wavelengths, and the different wavelengths behave physically very differently. But X-rays and radio waves are at their core the same phenomenon, which is kind of amazing. And the difference between those two ends of the spectrum are that one end they seem to act like waves, and the other end they seem to act like particles. And so we'll start talking about the photon model. Now, the first topic we're going to look at in the chapter is that of motional EMF. If I have a conductor which is moving in a magnetic field, it exerts forces on the charges, and the charges will continue to move until there's an electric force which exactly balances the magnetic force on them. And when that happens, there's a difference in potential between the two sides of the conductor. And the difference in potential that you get is just equal to the product of the speed times the length of the conductor times the magnetic field. And there's a great derivation of that you can see in the textbook. That's really important in a lot of practical situations, and one place we'll look at. Now, you know that sharks always have to be swimming in order to keep water moving over their gills, and you also know that sharks have a keen electric sense, and it turns out the fact that they are moving and that they have electric sense allows them to sense magnetic fields. And let's do a quick calculation. So suppose we have a shark moving at 2 meters per second, and its head is 0.6 meters wide, and let's assume the Earth's magnetic field is 50 microteslas, and it's perpendicular to the shark's head, as it could be in many parts of the shark's range. As the shark moves, it's going to develop a potential difference across its head, and the magnitude of the potential difference is the speed the shark swims at times the length of the head times the value of the magnetic field. For a typical value of the Earth's magnetic field, this gives us a difference in potential of 60 microvolts. So the shark is easily able to detect the Earth's magnetic field because the shark can sense a potential difference of 5 nanovolts. This 60 microvolts is larger than that by a factor of about 12,000. And in fact, what that means is the sharks can detect not just the Earth's magnetic field, but they can detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field. And they use that to navigate in the ocean. And we'll talk about a specific example of how the sharks do that. Very, very cool. After talking about motional EMF, we're going to talk about the idea of induced currents in conductors. And to do that, we're going to consider the notion of flux. Now, flux is basically the amount of magnetic field that goes through a conducting loop. So suppose we have a loop of a conductor. There's magnetic field lines. They go through the loop. You can basically think of the amount that goes through the loop as being the following. The product of the area of the loop. The bigger the magnetic field, or the bigger the area, the more magnetic field goes through. The magnitude of the magnetic field, the stronger the field, the more field goes through, and the angle of the loop. So it's A times B times the cosine of theta. And theta is the angle between an axis of the loop, and that's a line that is perpendicular to the plane of the loop, and the magnetic field lines. That's what theta is. Now, we'll typically consider cases where theta is equal to 0 degrees. And in cases where theta is equal to 0 degrees, the cosine of theta just turns into 1. And so the flux is just equal to A times B. That's typically the situation which we're going to consider. So if I have a loop of area A and a magnetic field B, we'll typically consider the flux of the loop is just equal to the product of the area times the magnetic field. And if the flux is changing, that will induce a current, okay? And the sense of the current is going to be to oppose the change. So we'll look at an example in class where I'm moving a magnet closer to a loop, and as you do that, I'm getting more flux that's downward through the loop. And when I'm making flux go downward through the loop makes its own flux, which goes upward. So it's making a flux which opposes the change. This is an example we'll consider in class. So suppose we have a magnetic field that's going through the loop. If the magnitude of the magnetic field is decreasing, what will be the direction of the current in the loop? You can think about that, and we will talk about that in class. We are also going to look at the EMF that's induced in the loop. When I have a changing magnetic field, current flows because there's an EMF in the loop. And the magnitude of the EMF is just equal to the rate of change of the flux, the amount of change of flux divided by the time interval over which it changes. And if I consider a coil where I have n turns of wire, the EMF is just equal to the flux per coil, the change in flux per coil, divided by the time over which that change occurs. So one case we'll look at in class is this. I'm going to bring in a coil of wire, and I got a coil of wire like so. And I'm going to take a magnet, and I'm going to insert that magnet into the coil. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to insert it like so. And when I do that, I'm going to be increasing the flux in the loop. If I do that quickly enough, this coil is going to be connected to a light bulb, a little LED, and the little LED will in fact light up. And that's a problem that we will solve in class. And then here's another practical question we'll consider. And you may have seen this. If you have a card which has a magnetic strip on it, and your card loses its magnetization, which it can do, it can weaken. If you take the card and you swipe it, and if you swipe it more quickly, that leads to a more accurate read. Why would that be true? Give that some thought. We'll talk about that in class. Now, there are a lot of practical cases of picking up vibrations that use magnetism. And I'll show you one example. If you can make a guitar pick up this way. This person has put a magnet on a block of wood, and then there's some coils of wire on top of it, and then there's a guitar with steel strings on top of that. When the strings vibrate, or the strings are magnetized by the magnet, which is right here. And so that magnetizes the strings. As the string vibrates back and forth, it changes the field inside the coil. And so you're going to get a changing field, you're going to get a changing flux, you're going to have an EMF, and the EMF is just proportional to the vibration of the string. And so guitar pickups pick up magnetic fields, and we will take a look at that. Another thing that works to pick up magnetic fields is a moving coil microphone. So if I have a moving coil microphone, I've got a magnet, and this is kind of a complicated magnetic pole arrangement. Don't worry about the details of it, but it produces a magnetic field inside a coil. And as the coil moves back and forth, like so, the magnetic field inside it changes. Changing field, changing flux, EMF, and the EMF is just proportional to the vibration. And so microphones are sensitive to magnetic fields as well. Now, one of the coolest applications of induction is this. If you have a changing magnetic field, it makes a current, and it does that because the changing magnetic field induces an electric field. It's also true a changing electric field induces a magnetic field, so there's a certain symmetry here. And it turns out a Scottish physicist in the 1800s basically wrote down everything that was known at the time about electric and magnetic waves with a series of equations, and they're called Maxwell's equations. I want you to know these exist, but I don't want you to know the details of them. But it turns out this one right here basically says a changing magnetic field induces an electric field, and the one right here says a changing electric field induces a magnetic field. And if you take those two and you combine them, it predicts the existence of waves of electric and magnetic fields. That is, if I have a wave of electric field, it induces a wave of magnetic field, which induces a wave of electric field. And I can have a bundle of waves which travel together through space. And they travel together through space at the speed that's right here, 3 × 10⁸ meters per second. And Maxwell predicted this. And then folks said, oh, well, if they're traveling through space at that speed, it turns out that is the number that is the speed of light. And could it be that light is an electromagnetic wave? And it turns out it is, but it's not just light. It's radio waves and microwaves and X-rays and gamma rays and infrared and ultraviolet and visible light. All of them are electromagnetic waves. They are waves of electric and magnetic fields that propagate through space, which is kind of amazing. Now, a couple of properties that we'll look at with the waves. First off, electromagnetic waves are waves, and so we can identify a wavelength associated with them. And then for all electromagnetic waves, we know that the speed is equal to the product of the frequency times the wavelength. Okay? And in the case of electromagnetic waves, they all travel at the same speed. That is the speed of light, which is 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. So if you know the frequency or the wavelength of an electromagnetic wave, you can predict its frequency because the speed that they travel at is a constant. And it's kind of amazing. They're like radio waves, microwaves, light waves, gamma rays, X-rays, all of them travel at the same speed. They are at their core the same physical phenomenon. Now, since they're waves, there's a certain amplitude associated with the waves. Okay, the amplitude of a wave is basically how far from zero does it get at its maximum. There's an amplitude of the electric field. There's also an amplitude of the magnetic field, and that is something we'll take a look at. And one of the questions we'll consider, since radio waves are waves of electric and magnetic fields, why do you have to put antennas on the outside of the car? And this is related to a thing we talked about earlier in this semester, which is why are you safe in a car in a lightning strike? So I want you to give that some thought. We'll talk about that in class. One of the things you're going to do in lab is you're going to use an AM radio to look at where radio stations are. Okay, and the way you're going to do it is this. Radio waves from AM radios use this ferrite bar inside the radio to pick up the magnetic field component. And we saw on a previous slide, if you have an electromagnetic wave coming towards you, you have waves of electric fields. Then you have perpendicular to that, you have waves of magnetic fields like so. So the magnetic field is going horizontally. And if the magnetic field lines go through this coil of wire, they produce a magnetic field inside the coil of wire, and there's a ferrite bar inside it, and the point of the ferrite bar is to increase the strength of the magnetic field. It's a magnetic material, and so I have a changing flux inside a coil of wire, and when I have a changing flux in a wire, I have an EMF, and so an AM radio antenna uses the magnetic field component of the electromagnetic wave to pick it up, and you can tell where a radio station is by turning an AM radio. And we'll talk about in class how this works. And it's kind of amazing because the magnetic component of the wave, okay, if a wave is coming towards you, the magnetic field is oscillating horizontally. So if you take your coil and I arrange it like this, the magnetic field goes through the loop. If I took the coil and arranged it like this, the field would not go through the loop. And so you can tell the position of a radio station. That's something that you'll get a chance to experience in the lab this week. Now, the plane of the magnetic field is important if you're doing AM radio reception, but the plane of the electric field is important for a lot of different things. And the plane that the field vectors lie in is called the plane of the polarization. And if I have a polarizer, it's only going to let through light of one particular polarization state. And if polarized light hits a filter, and its polarization is not the same as that of the filter, only some of it will go through. You can read about that in the textbook. We're not going to worry about the quantitative details of that, but we will worry about polarization because there's some very interesting applications to polarization. And one of them is this. It turns out the light from the sky is polarized. So here's a little picture from the textbook of 4 polarizers. And you can see the axes of the polarizers are like so. And this is looking at the sun 90 degrees, the sky 90 degrees orientation to the sun. This one is looking at the sky 160 degrees to the sun. And you can see these 2 polarizers here appear dark. Well, it turns out bees can sense the polarization of sunlight. And if you know, this set of polarizers was tipped so that I had the maximum difference between these 2 polarizers and these 2 polarizers. And when you do that, the direction of the polarization is in the direction that works like so. It's like the axes of the dark polarizers that points you basically toward the sun. And so bees can tell where the sun is in the sky just by seeing a patch of clear sky, which is kind of amazing. And it has to do with how the electromagnetic waves are detected in their visual systems, and they have these rabdomes, they have these collections of little visual cells, etc., etc. We'll talk about that briefly in class. Now, something that's really important for us this week, it's our first instance of a quantum notion, is the idea of photons. It turns out light is not a continuous phenomenon. Light comes to us as in chunks of energy of a certain size, and those chunks are called photons. And the energy of an individual photon depends upon the frequency. The energy is equal to Planck's constant times the frequency, or Planck's constant times the speed of light divided by the wavelength. But there's another relationship which is more useful for us, and it's this one here. If I know I have an electromagnetic wave of a wavelength given in nanometers, the energy of the photons in electron volts is equal to 1240 divided by the wavelength in nanometers. So for instance, if I have light of wavelength 620 nanometers, and that's basically in the yellow-orange part of the spectrum, the energy of those photons in electron volts is just 2.0 electron volts. And electron volts is a convenient unit for two reasons. One, we know a thing or two about electron volts because we worked with them back in chapter 21, but it's also true that the electron volt is a reasonably good size scale. How much energy does it take to do something at an atomic level? The answer is about 1 electron volt. Less than 1 electron volt, you kind of don't get to play. More than 1 electron volt, you can. If you want to break bonds between water molecules, you need several electron volts, okay? And so we'll talk about that. But the 1 electron volt is kind of a decent energy scale. Now here's the complete electromagnetic spectrum, and these are typical values that we can just use as a reference. Okay, if I look at FM radio, it's really long wavelengths, and therefore relatively low frequencies, and as a consequence, very, very low photon energies. Whereas if we look at ultraviolet light, which has short wavelengths, it's got very, very high frequencies, and as a consequence, it has very, very high photon energies. And the high photon energies are important in terms of understanding its biological effect, which is something we'll talk about. Now, remember, electromagnetic waves are waves. And I have this basic relationship that the speed of the wave is equal to the product of the frequency times the wavelength. The frequency is proportional to 1 over the wavelength. So if I have increasing frequency, that corresponds to decreasing wavelengths. So short wavelengths are going to correspond to higher photon energies. And that will be an important consideration for us. Now, electromagnetic waves are waves, and so we can do some calculations that we did for waves back in chapter 15, if you remember, for sound waves. We looked at intensity. It's the ratio of the power to the area, and we will start by computing the power output of a laser pointer. It makes a tiny spot on the screen, and the intensity is actually pretty big, as we will calculate. But it turns out for light and other electromagnetic waves, the intensity is related to the strength of the fields. And the intensity is given by these two relationships right here. Now, we're not going to worry too much about those relationships, but what I will worry about is this. The electric field magnitude is proportional to the square root of the intensity, according to that equation right here. And if I've calculated the electric field intensity, I can calculate the magnetic field intensity by just saying it's the electric field intensity divided by the speed of light. So these two relationships will be very important to us. And this quantity epsilon 0 is the one that we saw previously when we were talking about potentials and voltages and capacitors and things like that. And this C, that's just the speed of light. So here's the kind of question we'll consider. Inside the cavity of a microwave oven, the 2.4 gigahertz electromagnetic waves have an intensity of 5 kilowatts per square meter. Two questions. One, what is the strength of the electric field? And two, how about the magnetic field? And we will do that calculation, and it turns out the strength of the electric field is something like 2,000 volts per meter, which is a lot. And so if you put something metal inside a microwave oven, it'll develop a big potential difference across it, and so you might get sparking, and that is something which we will talk about in class. The magnitude of the magnetic field, turns out, is really, really small, because the magnitude of the magnetic field is equal to the magnitude of the electric field divided by the speed of light, and the speed of light is really big. Now, if you have spherical waves of spherical electromagnetic waves, they vary. They decrease in intensity with the distance from a source, just exactly as we talked about back in chapter 15. The intensity is equal to the power of the source divided by 4 pi r squared. So, if you're at some distance from a cell phone tower, the further away you get, the more the signal decreases in intensity, the fewer bars that you get, okay, because they emit spherical waves, and so does your phone. And we're going to do a calculation for what is the intensity of the signal from your cell phone, which puts out a very small energy of 0.6 watts at a tower 2 kilometers away, which is kind of a typical distance. And then we'll also calculate what electric and magnetic field strengths that corresponds to. And it turns out they are breathtakingly small. It's kind of amazing that you can do this. You can detect fields that small at that distance. There's some fancy electronics going on to make that happen. Now, back to the photon model, okay? We're going to consider different types of visible light and different energies. So we have to look at red pen lasers and violet pen lasers, okay, or blue pen lasers, and we'll look at the photon energies they emit and ask this question: which emits higher photon energies, the red or the blue? And of course, long wavelength, red, corresponds to a lower photon energy than the shorter wavelengths of blue. So it means that blue light can do things that red light can't. But we're also going to look at which one emits more photons per second. Suppose I have two lasers that have the same power, and here's my question: which emits more photons per second? I want you to give that some thought, and that is something we will talk about in class. Now, given the range of photon energies, it turns out we can divide the electromagnetic spectrum into two parts. The long wavelength end, they basically look like waves. So radio waves look like waves. The short wavelength end, like X-rays, gamma rays, they look like particles. The photon energy is so high, they don't really look like waves, they look like particles. And in the middle, in the visible light region of the spectrum, it depends. It depends on what you're asking to do. Sometimes we treat visible light as a wave. Sometimes we treat it as a particle, i.e. a photon. And how you treat it kind of depends on the situation. Now we want to look at the biological effects of electromagnetic wavelengths. And if I have long wavelengths, i.e. low photon energies, they look like waves, and it basically makes heating. If I have short wavelengths, they look more like particles, and so as a consequence they can have individual interactions with individual atoms, and so they can produce, in this case, a baby is being put under ultraviolet light, a preemie, in order to deal with jaundice, okay? And so it can actually have an effect on molecules inside the body because it's going to act like little particles of light, little photons. And one of the questions we're going to ask about, oh yeah, don't worry about this, that was there because I forgot and left it there, is when you talk on the cell phone, how dangerous is it? And so we're going to look at numbers for it. When you talk on the cell phone, 5 centimeters away from the cell phone, so like inside your noggin, what is the intensity, what is the electric field strength, and what is the photon energy? We're going to consider that. And it turns out it's fine, but it is going to produce a certain amount of heating, and that is something we'll talk about in class. And we'll also look at organisms that emit photons, because they're ones that do. And whatever the organisms are saying, it's obviously really, really important, because we're going to look at an example of a copepod, and it emits flashes of light that consist of a whole lot of photons. And the photons have a wavelength of 490 nanometers. They're short wavelength, and so they have fairly high photon energy. And how many ATPs does it take to create each photon? The answer is a lot. That is something which we will talk about. And they're also going to look at how much power it puts out, and it's quite a lot. It's quite a lot. And so that will be a nice application of the photon model. Now, we're also going to look at the emission of wavelengths, emission of electromagnetic waves by hot objects. And it turns out the peak wavelength varies as a function of temperature. So hot objects tend to emit shorter wavelengths. If you look at the filament in an incandescent light bulb, it's at a temperature of about 2500 Celsius. And at that temperature, the peak wavelength is not in the visible part of the spectrum. It's in the infrared region of the spectrum beyond the red end. And this is why incandescent light bulbs are so inefficient. 100 watts of electric energy comes in. 4 watts of visible light energy comes out. So they're only 4% efficient. That's why they're terrible. And you can do better using other technologies. The other thing we'll look at is the fact that your body has a certain temperature associated with it. And so you emit energy at a certain peak wavelength. And it turns out it's a fairly long wavelength. But you emit a lot. The amount of energy you emit is significant. And creatures are able to spot you because of that. But then we're going to look at creatures which don't have eyes that are adapted to sense thermal radiation, but we'll look at ones which are adapted to detect visible light and things near the visible part of the spectrum like infrared and ultraviolet. And we'll start by talking about humans. And humans have cones with 3 different energies that are sensitive to 3 different photon energies and therefore primarily sensitive to 3 different parts of the visible light spectrum. Okay? But there's other creatures that have eyes which are very different. Now, another thing we'll look at is electronics. And it turns out electronics have a smaller photon energy required to be able to sense light. And so most cameras, as you will see in lab, are sensitive to wavelengths beyond the visible light portion of the spectrum. They can be sensitive into the infrared. We have a little device in lab that will let you take a look at that. We're also going to look at short wavelength electromagnetic waves. And it turns out if you look at wavelengths emitted by mercury emits 2 wavelengths of ultraviolet light. One of them is about 365 nanometers. One of them is about 254. And the energy and electron volts of these 2 are different enough that they have very different effects. And the one over here in the tanning beds, that's enough to stimulate melanin production. The one over here in the germicidal lamps, that is enough to kill cells. And it turns out there's a threshold for damaging DNA that's kind of like right in the middle. And so there is a threshold beyond which electromagnetic waves are damaging because it will damage molecules, and specifically molecules of DNA. Now, even higher energy than ultraviolet is X-rays. And it turns out if you accelerate electrons in some sort of a tube, as we've talked about, and you slam them into a metal target, they will emit X-rays. And the X-rays have much higher photon energies that makes them more penetrating. It also makes them an example of ionizing radiation. They will rip electrons off of atoms. They will damage molecules. They will do all kinds of mischief at an atomic or a cellular scale. But it makes them useful because you can take an X-ray tube that emits X-rays, you can cast them through, say, your hand, and you can cast a shadow of the bones and other things in your body which have a higher atomic number. And as soon as people discovered X-rays, they realized they could do with this, and they were taking X-rays of all sorts of different things. And they weren't too worried about the fact that doing so was damaging some cells, and that is something we will talk about in class as well. And after that, after considering photons, we're going to go ahead and consider other things which are very much of a quantum. And the next topic we're going to consider is Chapter 28, and Chapter 28 is quantum physics. We're looking at things which have a distinct quantum nature, and exactly what that means is something we'll talk about in class.